Welcome everyone to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization now representing a growing body of more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the 47-story skyscraper that collapses suddenly, uniformly, symmetrically into its own footprint on the afternoon of 9/11. I'm looking forward to talking to you about it today, but first, let's introduce you to Andy Steele, our operations manager. Hey, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know, as I always do, that I'm here to help with any technical glitches which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be taking your questions at the end of the course, or the webinar, I should say. You just submit them in the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. I'll also be watching the comments on our YouTube broadcast of this webinar and on Facebook as well for any comments or questions that are related to the material that Richard will be presenting. So with all that said, back to you, Richard.
And thank you, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before moving on to this critically important task of exposing what really happened at the World Trade Center, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time and on this project, and let's talk about, there it is, Building 7. Did you even know about it? You know, most architects and engineers don't even know about the third worst structural failure in modern history. This is Building 7. And it should be the most studied building failure of all, and you're going to find out why today. I mean, there's a 47-story skyscraper, and it'd be the tallest building in most of our states. And on the afternoon of 9/11, it collapses. So here it is, part of the World Trade Center complex built by Larry Silverstein, developer who subsequently purchased the entire World Trade Center complex 6 weeks prior to 9/11, by the way. And it's was not hit by an airplane. So this building is about 110 yards from the North Tower, about a football field. And, you know, it did get some damage to it from when the North Tower sent out its lateral ejections up to 600 feet in every direction. But here it is standing tall after the collapse of the Twin Towers, as you can see in this iconic photograph. This is Building 7 here. So let's take a look at the collapse. Nist, by the way, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people, says that this damage was not a significant factor in the building's collapse. So that's really important. Here's the collapse of the building here. We'll take a quick look, and then we'll zoom in on its different features. There's the penthouse collapsing first, 6 seconds prior to the overall building collapse, an isolated cause there. And then obviously, and according to the study, the 4-year study that we're going to tell you about from the University of Alaska, and then the whole building collapses in 7 seconds. Now, let's look at Nist's cause of the collapse here from Shyam Sunder, the project leader of their report.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Okay, which fires? Well, these fires that were few and small and scattered, as you can see. And in all the photographs and videos that we have, these are the worst fires that we have evidence for. And those fires are on the east side, near the area of interest by Nist at maybe 2:30 in the afternoon, but they move over to the west by 3 p.m. They're out of that area, and yet Nist focuses their initiation of collapse theory on the east, under the east penthouse, because it did collapse first, and that's where their theory starts. We'll take a look at that in detail. Column 79. The damage was on the other side of the building, on the south side of the building. The damage from the World Trade Center North Tower. So Nist has a fire simulation that they provide, where they show those fires at 2 o'clock, and then on the south side, but moving to the east side at 2:30, 3 o'clock, but then hovering around column 79 for about 2 hours altogether. Now, this is a problem because even Nist acknowledges that such fires did not persist in any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. So how can they be hovering around that area? Well, let's look at the actual photos and see what they reveal. 3:50 p.m., more than an hour before the collapse of this building. The 12th and 13th floor do not have fires on them at all. And yet Nist is telling us in their computer fire simulation that the column 79 has fires all the way up until 5 p.m. So more consistent with the photographs and the videos are the AE 911 Truth fire simulation, which shows those fires around column 79, 3 o'clock, but by 4 o'clock and certainly 5 o'clock, they're gone from that area. So that's an extremely important inconsistency, one of dozens and dozens that we're going to be taking a look at today. Let's go back to Shyam Sunder, see what he says about this.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
Okay. For the first time, remember this, because this is completely unprecedented, that fires have never brought down.
And you can see on the screen,
skyscraper.
The column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
Okay, so they have a computer model to back this up. We'll look at that in some more detail. But let's talk about their initiation of collapse theory. Because first of all, they're saying, A, the fire was in this area for 2 hours, which we already saw it wasn't and couldn't be, according to Nist's admission. B, they say the fire is under these long span beams spanning 50 feet, expanded these columns. Well, that couldn't happen because these columns are fireproofed, as you see halfway through the fireproofing process here. So they couldn't have expanded due to the heat. This is 2 hour fire protection on these beams. C, they say it pushed this girder off of its seat on this column 79. The seat is blown up over here. Well, that couldn't have happened because this girder has what? It has shear studs, 30 of them. So it's not going to be pushed sideways or anyways. Those shear studs tie that beam up to the concrete slab, the deck sitting on it. D, When this girder slid off of its seat, which it couldn't have, by the way, E, because that seat's 12 inches wide. That girder would have had to have been pushed to the right 12 inches in order to fall off its seat. But Nist says, oh no, it only had to be pushed halfway off of its seat because these flanges, the bottom flange would have folded after the web, the vertical element, cleared the edge of the seat. But that couldn't be true because there were stiffeners there. These 3/4 inch stiffeners here in plan view and here in elevation view. They were welded on. This is from the shop drawings. The shop drawings are how the building is actually built, but Nist omitted those on purpose and finally admitted doing that, saying that, oh, we didn't show those because they weren't there to support the flange. They were there to support the web. Well, the truth is that they support both very clearly. So where are we? F. They say, when this girder fell off of its seat, this floor 13 came down with it. Well, that couldn't have happened because there's two other massive girders framing in to that column that would have supported that floor, even if this girder did somehow manage to be pushed off of its seat by that raging fire, which wasn't even there. And what do they do with that fire? In their computer model, they applied all that heat, 1400 degrees Fahrenheit or so. All of that heat went into these long span beams in 1.5 seconds, forcing in their computer model these beams to expand. Otherwise, they would have sagged, as beams naturally do, as you'll see in the video coming up. So let's just say floor 13 did fall on 12. Well, in order to break the shear connection of floor 12, floor 13 at that point would have had to have had 632,000 pounds of force, dynamic force. It only had a tenth of that. So it couldn't have broke through floor 12. Let's go back to Nist's computer animation.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
We'll see how well it matches. If you're looking carefully, well, let's compare them.
Here is our structural.
Let's compare them right now. So on the left, the video, the penthouse comes down. Okay, you got that part. But you're breaking 400 structural steel connections every second in this left or east vertical section of this building. They didn't model, for some reason, the right part. It was almost infinitely stiff. So, well, they modeled the lower part of it. It's interesting. It's obviously not an organic collapse. They have the left side failing the structural connections, 400 of them every second. And then the whole thing begins to tip over. Doesn't look anything like the video. And they stop it after 2 seconds. Why? 2 seconds of the actual overall collapse. Why? Because it would be completely obvious that it didn't behave like the video. So we have some real problems here. So we filed a Freedom of Information Act request for them to release their computer data. But it was denied. Why? They said it might jeopardize public safety. Wait a minute. How does it jeopardize public safety to provide to the architects and engineers around the world who design these buildings, who are tasked with ensuring the public safety. Now, this is not open. This is not the use of the scientific method, which is what we use at AE 911 Truth. We have a question. How did the tower come down? What caused it to collapse? We do background research. How have other towers collapsed? Make observations. We construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess. Maybe it came down by fire. Okay, a reasonable hypothesis. The building had fires. Maybe it came down by explosions and controlled demolitions. Another reasonable hypothesis, as you'll see the evidence for today. We test that hypothesis after making predictions. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. We don't hide the computer input data from the architects and engineers who could peer review this process and get to the heart of what really happened here. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back. We construct a new hypothesis until we have one that is supported by the data, the experiments, and so on. Okay, well, let's do some background research. How have other high-rises been destroyed? Well, fire is certainly one cause. It's an organic, chaotic process. Burns out an area in roughly 20 minutes, as Nist even acknowledged. And it moves on, looking for fresh new fuel sources. But there's one problem here. We've never had a skyscraper collapse due to fire. Not a steel frame fireproof skyscraper before 9/11. So we've had wood frame buildings, but they would fall over to the path of least resistance. It's following the laws of entropy, increasing disintegration, chaos in a situation like this. So there's been tests like this one in the UK, 8-story building built in 1995 in order to burn it down. The steel frame building. You can see all the fuel in here. They really wanted to get this thing down. They were not fooling around. We don't allow fuel loads like that in today's skyscrapers. And they set it on fire. Well, let's see what happens.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring to 9/11 when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse ostensibly due to fire, and of course some damaged columns in the case of the Twin Towers, which we'll get to in our next part 2 and 3 of this series, by the way. So you saw the beams sagging there. So that's what they do when they're allowed to build up that heat over a long period of time. And here, up to 1800 degrees, I think. So, but you can see the warpage in the steel, but the connections are strong. They don't fail. They're the strongest part. Inherently stable, the executive summary, due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. What about other buildings that have had fires in them in real life? There's been about 100 of them with larger, longer lasting and hotter fires in these buildings. Let's take a look at a few of them. Whoops. Come on. Now, why doesn't this video want to play? Well, that's really disappointing. The 62-story building In Los Angeles, burned for 3.5 hours over 5 floors, no collapse. In Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors, no collapse. In Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors, no collapse. They just don't collapse. And not even after 9/11, by the way, where each of these high rises are completely engulfed in flames. Did any of them collapse? No. How about natural collapses? Not due to fires, in this case, earthquakes. These buildings fall over to the path of least resistance, generally. You can recognize the building, though it's certainly badly damaged. It's recognizable as a building. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. These buildings were exploded. There's thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized building materials, expanding rapidly in cauliflower-shaped form due to the incredible heat from the hot gases released from the explosions. There's witnesses then that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. Explosions, of course, can be used quite effectively to bring tall buildings down in a procedure known as controlled demolition, like this. They place the shaped cutter charges at the columns and beams connections in the building and set them off in a particular order, synchronized floor by floor typically, so they can bring the building down however they want, usually straight down, but not always. So there's a set of features associated with controlled demolitions. Let's look at them. One, there's a sudden onset of destruction created by the removal of those columns, usually at the base of the structure. There's a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint, because that's what they're trying to achieve. That's because there's a patterned removal of column supports. That's how you get the symmetry. And that results in a free fall acceleration, usually, or nearly so, through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structural steel in the columns, and results also in the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. It's broken up, ready for loading and shipment. There's limited damage to adjacent structures. Feature number 6, this is one of the goals, of course, of controlled demolition. Feature number 7, there's patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. There's broken up concrete floors, if not into chunks, they don't have to go back with a jackhammer and break those up manually. They do that with the explosives. And so there are explosive charges, feature number 9, visible at many of the floors, typically. And there's chemical evidence, of course, left behind. This is how we know we have a set of direct evidence that's associated with the destruction with explosives. Fire does not create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformation following the path of least resistance. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, such as government documentation, this can be very helpful if you have it. Foreknowledge, people know in advance. We'll be looking at that today with respect to Building 7. Experts agreeing that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter. And video documentation, of course, can be very helpful in proving controlled demolition. Hey, I got an idea. Let's apply this model to Building 7 and see if it has any of these features, beginning with feature number 1. Is there a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure? Let's jump to CBS News with Dan Rather and his commentary while looking at this collapse.
And what you're seeing are high shocks. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What? Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down? No. How did he know that? Well, he never repeated this after 9/11. In fact, we never seen Building 7 coming down on mainstream media. It's as if it's been wiped under the rug. An extraordinary omission. Again, the third worst structural failure in modern history. Feature number 2, is there a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's take a look from West Street. Pretty symmetrical, pretty straight down. Yeah. By the way, the east penthouse has already come down. It's on the left side here, the east side. And what we're seeing is the entire west penthouse and screen wall in the center of this building drop a half a second prior to the overall building collapse. What does that mean? We were told that by Nist that this progression of collapse started at the east and worked its way to the west over a period of 6 to 10 seconds. But in order for the entire penthouse and screen wall assemblies to collapse straight down a half a second prior to the overall collapse, that means the structure underneath them must have been removed instantly. And then a half a second later, the rest of the columns in the building, the exterior. Well, that's what they do in controlled demolition. They remove the core first and then the exterior so that the exterior is pulled over the top of the core. Yes, and it falls mostly into its own footprint. It is symmetrical. A classic. A very well done controlled demolition. Let's look at side by side. I'm not quite convinced yet. Let's put building 7 on the left and a series of known controlled demolitions on the right. Okay, this one's not going to play either. There we go. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like these controlled demolitions, especially since fire, the official cause of this building on the left, its destruction, has never brought down a skyscraper before 9/11. Unprecedented. This is an extraordinary claim made by Nist, requiring extraordinary evidence, but they completely omitted dealing with this reality until September of 2011, 10 years later, where they published their FAQs, in which they finally had to address the very frequently asked question, could an explosion have caused the collapse? And they said Nist concluded that blast events inside the building did not occur and found no evidence supporting the existence of a blast event. Well, did they look? No, they did not test for explosives, as you'll see. The smallest blast, they say, capable of failing the building's critical column would have resulted in a 130 decibel sound. Well, maybe not. Maybe there's another way to bring tall buildings down without high energy explosives. We'll look for that today. And yet, small random fires brought this building down symmetrically, when fully engulfed fires couldn't bring buildings down at all, historically. Feature number 3, patterned removal of column supports. How do you bring a building down symmetrically? You've got to take out all of the core columns within a fraction of a second of each other. And then after that, all the perimeter columns. That's how you do it. Any deviation in that pattern, the big building will obviously begin to tip over. You see, this is not rocket science that we're about today. These fires brought that building down symmetrically. Because fire have that level of precision. No, it's not rocket science. Feature number 4, how fast is the building coming down? Let's go to David Chandler, physics teacher, and learn something here.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to free fall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
What does that mean? The building falling through its own structure at zero resistance?
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
Nist is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
Yes, the reaction from a vertical column is to give all of its strength until it begins to buckle. But even after it buckles, it still provides up to 25% of its strength, even when it's bending, which means that it's going to resist and slow down that collapsing building. It's not going to fall at free fall as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. Well, Nist was embarrassed in a public conference about this very phenomena, which they originally denied for years that it came down by free fall. And then they were forced into admitting it by members of AE 911 Truth. And here in the final report, they actually admit that at stage 2, there is free fall for a third of this building's collapse. But they don't acknowledge the implications of that free fall, which is that all those columns had to have been removed somehow. Well, how do you do that? Well, feature number 5 shows the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. I mean, we had a 47-story moment-resisting steel frame skyscraper where the columns and beams are rigidly welded to each other. And yet it collapses like a house of cards. Remember, buildings that collapse naturally, the columns and beams are not severed one from another. And remember, the concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. But let's first look at the damage to adjacent structures because, yes, it's very limited. The center of the building pile is in the center of the property. There's very little damage to adjacent structures. Are there sounds of explosions heard by witnesses? Well, not according to Shyam Sunder.
we did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
That size blast? Well, maybe that's not what we're talking about, that size blast. Maybe we're not talking about high energy explosives. Yet, there, as we'll get to, there were witnesses of explosions. Here's a few.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. And, it was horrifying. Then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
A shockwave ripping through the building, a sound of a clap of thunder, windows busting out, and then the building coming down. Not those things happening as the building's coming down. How about Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic?
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And this gentleman.
I'm going to call in Bill Rizzotti. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
Okay, and this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who, along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, they were trying to get back into the building. And they did. But it had been evacuated, and they didn't know why. And the building had been evacuated after the tower hit, after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down. And this is their experience.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What's the sound?
Like a boom. Like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Information of bombs? Bombs like this one heard in the late morning of 9/11 in the vicinity of Building 7?
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Does that sound like one floor hitting another? Bombs are not a part of the official story. Any part of it. There were seismic waves produced near the time of the collapse of Building 7. The official narrative from Nist says these are caused by the collapse. But if you look very closely, you find out something else. You find out that the seismic signal occurs at 5:20 and 42 seconds. But the start of the collapse doesn't happen until 10 seconds later. So how can the collapse cause the seismic signal 10 seconds earlier? Makes no sense, right? Well, Nist has an explanation for this. The seismic signal approximately 10 seconds prior to the onset of the collapse was likely due to the falling of debris from the interior of the collapse. Well, wait a minute. Let's look at that video again. The east penthouse falls 7 seconds earlier. But the overall, the core doesn't come down until half a second prior to the overall building. So how can there be any significant interior collapse to cause a seismic signal 10 seconds prior? The east penthouse doesn't even go all the way down, as evidenced by the lack of windows breaking underneath it. There's maybe 10 windows that break. This is not a significant top to bottom collapse, as Nist claims. Andre Rousseau comes along, 2009, applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published peer-reviewed papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology. He says they have an explosive origin. He says the bell-like form points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion on the ground due to the falling of debris. Seismic waves are only created by brief impulses and low frequencies. So these undeniably have an explosive origin. Well, that's very clear from this expert in 2012. And feature number 8, are there pyroclastic-like clouds? Interesting, because the National Fire Protection Association 921, the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations, is the accepted authority on how to investigate these things in America and quite a bit throughout the world. They say look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Well, this is exactly what we have. Racing in every direction away from the collapse of Building 7, incredibly hot plumes of rapidly expanding cauliflower-shaped gases. A whole lot of heat is producing this extremely rapid expansion. A lot more heat than this. And these fires surely were put out by the action of the floors collapsing, extinguishing those flames. We're probably looking at something on the order of this. Well, let's look for evidence of that, shall we? It's not going to be too hard to find. In fact, we're looking for extreme heat here, which is what we find on the pile of Building 7. These are the Twin Towers down here, Building 7. 1,340 degree temperatures on the surface. There's no fire on the surface of this pile. So where is the 1,340 degrees coming from? It's coming from something much hotter, deeper down in the pile, whose radiant heat is cooling off by the time it reaches the surface to 1,347 degrees. There's more evidence, for instance, from this structural engineer who had access to the landfill, looking at the beams from World Trade Center 7. And what does he say?
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
So he saw the melting of girders in World Trade Center. He documents this particular piece of steel from World Trade Center 7. It's clearly melted. In fact, the author of the Fema report that came out in May of 2002, Jonathan Barnett, says steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinary high temperatures. But there's a problem with this. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. The fires are only getting probably 500 or 600 degrees. Nist claims 1,200, 1,300 degrees, 1,400 degrees. We're still more than 3 times less than the temperatures needed to evaporate steel. Well, it's documented by FEMA also in their Appendix C, Metallurgical Examination of the Steel, where they document clearly, never before observed in building fires, eutectic reactions causing intergranular melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like you see here in this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation. Where does the sulfur come from? We'll get to that. Liquid iron, that's molten iron. That's 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit minimum. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. The New York Times calls it perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. This information was completely eliminated from the Nist report when they took over from FEMA in 2002 and produced their own report in 2008, 7 years later, yes. But they say, gosh, we didn't have any steel. Again and again and again, no steel from the building was recovered. No structural elements could be positively identified, and yet they identified the very piece of steel from Building 7 that FEMA tested. In fact, here's John Gross, the co-project leader of the Nist report, on the pile, cutting off the very piece of steel that was used for that metallurgical examination in Appendix C of FEMA's report. Hot sulfur corrosion, liquid molten iron. We're going to find where that comes from. His shadow is all over the evidence. So how do we get temperatures that hot? Buildings and even jet fuel only burn somewhere between 600 and 1,400 degrees. We're way below the requirement. We can see by the color of the molten material pouring out of the building debris held in the crab claw excavators. By its color, you can tell its temperature. We're exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit here. And some of it is white hot, much hotter than that. So what caused all this steel to melt? Let's look at feature number 10, chemical evidence. Could thermite have created all that molten metal? What is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, thermate in this case, it would explain the presence of the sulfur. Sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. It would explain the presence of iron, elemental iron. We haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for 100 years. This is not melted steel. This is molten iron, and we will get to that evidence in a moment. It would also explain the presence of the extreme temperatures. Thermite produces 4,000 degree temperatures. So is there evidence of thermite? Well, what else did the NFPA 921 say to look for? Unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. Nist says, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. A year later, when they were pressed in writing, they finally admit Nist did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you won't look for. Others did, though. One of them was Stephen Jones, nuclear physicist, formerly from Brigham Young University. He has sent a piece of slag from this sculpture from the World Trade Center complex. He says, gosh, would office fires do this to steel? We got a problem here. That's not the cut used by the iron workers with their thermal lances and their oxyacetylene torches. They can cut very cleanly through versus this. And this. Well, on the ends of the slag, what does Dr. Jones finds through X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy? He finds iron, elemental iron, and aluminum, chief ingredients of thermite. More interestingly, actually, manganese and sulfur, potassium, ingredients of ignited thermite in the World Trade Center sculptures. They're all over the United States that this testing can still be done and has been. But the U.S. Geological Survey doing testing on all of this dust, powdered concrete mostly, throughout Lower Manhattan in a 3 square mile area, finds in their 2005 report billions and billions of these previously molten iron microspheres. Well, again, where does the iron come from? There's no adequate explanation for the presence of billions of these spheres in all the World Trade Center dust samples. In fact, they comprise up to 6% of some of these dust samples. It amounts by extrapolation up to 4 tons of this material altogether, plus or minus. It's 150 times the background level of iron particles which can appear in common dust. So these are extremely unusual. The R.J. Lee group doing studies on the dust also finds that they're formed during the event, not before by the welders putting the steel frame together, not after by the iron workers cutting the steel frame apart, but during the event. There's so many of these, and they're so ubiquitous that it's used to determine what is and what is not World Trade Center dust. Well, how do you get liquid molten iron microspheres? Well, here's one way. A thermite experiment under controlled conditions. Very small amount of thermite, but a large amount of what? Sparks? Well, they look like sparks, but they're molten iron, as it turns out. They cool and they fall and they form themselves into spheres. Why? Because that's what aerosolized liquids do under pressure. Dispersed liquid particles form themselves into spheres. And in the case of molten iron, they cool and they fall. Is that why all the tops of the cars surrounding the World Trade Center are toasted? Is there any other reason for that in this very high heat event? Well, speaking of thermite, you can make your own thermite cutter charges, actually, in your backyard, like John Cole, civil engineer, did, and achieve some interesting results. See, it's not as loud as an explosion, but there's still noise. And in this case, cut almost completely clean through that beam. But there's much more sophisticated devices, thermite-based shaped cutter charges for cutting steel of substantial thickness, much more effective at cutting through steel because it projects thermite charges of molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds. And in fact, there are devices whose casings themselves are made out of consumable consolidated thermite. Nothing left behind but pools of molten iron, which we're seeing all over the place, as we'll see in part 3 of this series. But what else was found in the World Trade Center dust? Pretty amazing. Collections of dust from all of these locations across lower Manhattan. And 4 of these samples were peer-reviewed and put into a paper. And we have then the documentation of these red-gray chips. They thought they were paint, but they're attracted to a magnet, so they get real curious. They're red on one side, gray on the other, indicating that they're dual layered. The largest one's about a 1/16 of an inch long. They zoom in or do analysis on the red side. That's the most curious side. That's where the iron is. Makes sense. What do they find? Iron and aluminum. Iron and aluminum, the ingredients of thermite, in these chips in all the World Trade Center dust samples that they studied. Well, they get real curious now. They zoom into the red layer 50,000 times and find what? Rhomboidal shaped crystals of iron oxide and aluminum platelets, the ingredients of thermite. At the nanoscale, they're 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. This is extremely sophisticated material. It's set in a matrix of oxygen, silica, carbon. This is organic material responsible for the expansion of gases rapidly in TNT, or C4, or RDX, high energy explosives. So that's very interesting combination there too. Now, when these samples are put in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter, they ignite at about 758 Fahrenheit. What do they produce when they ignite? They produce molten iron microspheres with the same chemical properties of the molten iron microspheres that were discovered in all the World Trade Center dust samples. So you see, we know where all of those billions and billions of molten iron microspheres came from. They came from these red-gray chips, as if we didn't know. They're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see, this is an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of repeatable experimental data that can be used in a court of law to bring the real perpetrators of 9/11 to justice, if they can be summoned in a court procedure that is not co-opted and corrupted. You see, when you get these particles so extremely small, the surface area increases geometrically, so the chemical reaction occurs virtually instantaneously. So they've engineered an incendiary, which works by means of heat, to become more explosive, which works, of course, by means of gas expansion with that organic material. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This is an extremely sophisticated material made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So this peer-reviewed paper concludes that the red layer is unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology as highly energetic pyrotechnic. And you can read it. It's only 25 pages. It's in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. Look it up. Share it with others. This is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, these 10 features, any of them, let alone all of them. Why not? Well, we've not lost a high rise due to fire. The steel conducts that heat away from the source. So it never gets to 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, at which steel can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. We don't want that to happen. So we put fireproofing like we did on Building 7 in the mid 80s. Cementitious fireproofing, 2 hours on the beams, 3 hours on the columns. We also keep the tenants from bringing in huge fuel loads and keep the contractors from building these buildings out of flammable materials. And then to top that all off, we put sprinklers in these buildings. The sprinklers, in the case of Building 7, were set to test mode the morning of 9/11 for some unknown or untold reason. We have data from the Fema and Nist reports. You recall that Fema came out in 2002 with limited funding, maybe $600,000. Their efforts were quite hampered. According to the New York Times, they couldn't get access to the blueprints, couldn't get adequate access to the sites or to the public to appeal for photographs. Nist comes along, and we mentioned they completely threw out that Appendix C, metallurgical examination of the steel. They launched their investigation in August, stating that fires caused the collapse before they even got started. And they even acknowledged, we've had trouble getting a handle on Building 7. And again, with regard to the Building Performance Assessment report by Fema, this report was thrown out, and Fema by Nist, but Fema concluded further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve the issue of how this building collapsed. Well, for those hoping to resolve that issue, unfortunately, the evidence, the steel, easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, were carted away from the site and put on barges starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, sent to China for recycling, up to 400 truckloads per day. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. We saw with the few pieces of steel and other building debris that we've looked at that it had evidence, damning evidence to the official story, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't, which is why we have so many experts like this one, Danny Jawenko, crying out. Well, at least offering
Jawenko is the expert on this in Europe.
An opinion.
What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Het heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Yeah, that's exactly what it looks like, huh? And Hugo Bachmann, Department of Structural Dynamics, Earthquake Engineering. In my opinion, World Trade Center Building 7 was with great probability professionally demolished. And Kamal Obeid, one of 100 structural engineers, signed on to the petition at AE 911 Truth demanding a new investigation. He says a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. What does that sound like to you? Does fire do that? This is why we hired the University of Alaska. In fact, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, Professor Leroy Hulsey, the chairman of their civil engineering department, to conduct a 4-year study in which he had some extraordinary conclusions, computer modeling into Building 7. He started by citing the problem. Well, no other steel frame building had ever failed due to fire, so we have to ensure the public safety and understand the failure mechanism for this structure. So first they examine the response to the fire loads in this very sophisticated computer modeling, rule out scenarios that would not cause the collapse, and then 3, identify types of failures and locations that could have contributed to the observed collapse. So they use the same assumptions that Nist did, even though they found that dozens and dozens of these assumptions were fraudulent. They used them anyway to find out what would happen. So they simulated the local structural responses to the fire loading for floors 13 and below, like Nist did, examined the Nist collapse initiation hypothesis, which we talked about earlier, and simulated numerous failure scenarios and identified what would lead to the total collapse observed, as observed in the videos. So they put the steel frame in AutoCAD and then brought it over into Abacus software and SAP 2000. They modeled this same series of connections that Nist did. They find several interesting things through the course of their modeling. And we've talked about some of these already, of course. Here's what they find. Nist overestimated the exterior wall rigidity. It was flexible. So the movements weren't outside. In other words, that girder would have moved naturally in the other way, not in the direction that Nist said, and not as much. They found that the connections on several beams didn't break. They were very strong, as Nist claimed. That's after finding, by the way, that even using Nist's assumptions, the building didn't fail. At approach 3, they could try to find, well, how did this building fail? Well, if you take out columns 79, 80, and 81, like Nist did, it didn't fail. If it could lead to failure, the building would tip, which is what you see here. In other words, they kind of forced it to fail, and that's how it would fail. So they conclude that the collapse of World Trade Center 7 was a global failure, not a progressive collapse involving the sequential failure of columns. So the global collapse looks something like this. The east penthouse falls first in an isolated incident, unrelated to the failure of all the columns down about the 12th or 13th floor. So the essential findings here through all this was the fire did not cause the collapse of Building 7. The temperature was not high enough to cause the weakening of the steel framing. The thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and girders. And the building did not experience a progressive collapse, but a global collapse caused by what? The near simultaneous failure of all the columns. Well, how does that happen? They don't speculate. They just show that that's what we're looking at here. So if you look Whoops. If you look at the comparison of the Alaska model on the left, the Nist model on the right, and the video in the center, you can tell which is a more realistic model that actually mimics the behavior of the video. How about foreknowledge of the destruction? Here, the fire chief, Hayden, is saying to this structural engineer, if we allowed it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse? Why would you anticipate a collapse? No other steel frame high-rise has ever collapsed due to fire. But anyway, this structural engineer says, oh, 5 hours. Well, sure enough, he was right on the money. They won't give us the name of this engineer. He remains anonymous. The prediction could only have been made with foreknowledge, of course. Implicating, yes, Chief Hayden. How about these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back over their shoulder at Building 7, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
Building is about to blow up. Moving back.
All right, guys. Sorry.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. Flame, debris coming down.
What? The building is about to blow up? Flame and debris coming down? How do they know? Fire's never brought down a skyscraper before. Something's going on here. Well, here's Kevin McPadden. We heard him talk about explosions, like you wanted to grab onto something, like a rumbling under your feet. Before that, he's held back with others several blocks from Building 7. Actually, we don't know quite how far. But he's held back, and he's listening to a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker. And this is what he hears.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
What? Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? What's going on here? We have the BBC announcing the collapse of this building before it actually happens. Take a look.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. 20 minutes before it happened, the unprecedented collapse of a steel structure by fire. Well, get this. CNN's on the ball at 11:07.
In New York, Alan Dodd-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Aaron, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke.
50 stories went down. There's no other building that went down, much less a 50-story building, other than the Twin Towers. Had there been a collapse of Building 7 at that time, we wouldn't even have videos of it because it would have been completely obscured from the massive dust cloud that completely covered lower Manhattan from the Twin Towers. Maybe it was supposed to go down at that time for that reason. And those mysterious construction workers walking back, telling us the building is going to come down. Maybe they were fixing the dud of a controlled demolition. That's what some people believe. But here's what Larry Silverstein says a year later, after 9/11, on public television.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull. And then we watched the building collapse.
Wait a minute. They made the decision to pull? He says, oh no, I didn't mean pull it. I meant pull the firemen out of the building. Well, the firemen were not in the building fighting the fire. They were told not to fight it. They were told the building had structural damage. And is that what you say? Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it? And they made the decision to pull? Firefighters made the decision early on not to attempt to fight the fires, according to FEMA. They were kept out of the building. No manual firefighting operations were taken by the FDNY. No firefighting. What have we shown in this part one of this three-part series? Does the scientific method show the hypothesis of fire causing this building to come down or controlled demolition? You need to decide. We've shown 10 key characteristic features and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition. Direct evidence of destruction with incendiaries in this case. And no evidence of destruction from fire. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, we find this to be proof of controlled demolition. Let's find out what you think, though. You can give us your comments if you're watching live with us. We can, Andy, how do people ask questions here?
Certainly. Okay, please submit any questions that you might have in the input form we talked about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education, select the live webinars. You'll see it right there. Also, we'll be telling you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you are informed of this information, you agree this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Indeed, because you can subscribe to our a couple times a month, we send out a bulletin and let you know what's going on, the latest efforts we're making toward getting a real investigation, the latest evidence, who we're working with, really extraordinary stuff, very important. So it takes a minute to subscribe to that bulletin. So do that while you're there and get informed. We have all kinds of evidence here about Building 7 and the Twin Towers, as we'll get to in part 2 and 3 of this series. While you're there, sign our petition. If you're not an architect or engineer, you can support them. We have 20,000 others signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation. And the 3,000 architects and engineers are, there we go, are needing your support. Why? Because we're a 501c3. We work by means of donations. We are working full time. We have 6 employees. We're constantly at it. We do presentations all over the place, and we are sending, for instance, 400 of those studies that I showed you from World Trade Center Building 7 out to engineers associations all around the country. Those are the kinds of things we do with your support. We can't do it without it. So you can go here and donate. And even while you're there, become a member. Join the family of sustaining supporters of AE 9/11 Truth. And if you can't do that, please volunteer with us. We need your help. We have at least a couple of dozen volunteers. Andy, what are they all doing?
Absolutely. Well, they're hard at work right now, and it's very tough during the COVID shutdown, but they're doing a lot of things in terms of checking credentials and doing emails out to professors who happen to be checking their inbox right now. And we're doing things with our government outreach, trying to get a hold of these congressmen. And I see somebody left a comment on YouTube saying we need to stand up to the perps. And that is exactly true, and why you need to help out if you have the time and energy to do this. It's only a few hours a week. It's a little bit of work, but it really goes a long way, especially when we're all working hard as a team. So the first thing that you got to do in order to be part of this team is go to ae911truth.org. You go to the volunteer form. It's right up there at the top. You fill it out, and we will get in touch with you and see where you'll best fit. Usually it's where you find that you best fit. So that's the way to do it. And I really believe that after a lot of things kind of calm down, hopefully in the world, that they're going to relook at 9/11 and bring a lot of vindication to a lot of hardworking people out there. And of course, the most important thing is bring justice for the people who died on that day.
Right on. And if you like to work alone, there's things you can do. You can contact your elected representatives, contact television, radio, newspaper, send them the ae911truth.org link. You know, let us hang our necks on the line for you. Use 25,000 years of technical and building credibility that we have. That's why we're here, so that we can be used. Tell everybody that you know. Screen the DVDs. I'm going to show you an example of one of those. Send the brochures out. We have lots of brochures. You can get 100 of them for $10. Send the computer modeling study. You can download it yourself. It's 130 pages, PDF. Download it at WTC7evaluation.org and send that to architects and engineers out there. And know that we've challenged Nist yet again on their faulty, fraudulent, deceptive, illegal report. And here are the points that we have highlighted, which we've gone through today, actually. So you'll recognize these points. And know that this is in appeal now. We have submitted the request. They've illegally denied each point of these requests, these 8 points, and we have now appealed that, and we will sue them if that fails. So stand by for that, and know that we have the legislation. And what have we done with this draft legislation, Andy? You're the expert on this.
We have done everything that we can with it. It is still there. It's still waiting, like the telltale heart, you know, the heart beneath the floorboards, I think the way the story goes. And we keep on beating the drum on this. And it's something that's so easy that you can do. I mean, I think this is actually, I don't know if I consider it volunteer activity, whatever you want to consider. It's very simple. You just contact your congressman. We actually wrote out a whole article explaining what to put in there. Make the request for a meeting, then just write to us at Congress at ae911truth.org. Tell us that you did it. We keep track of it, and we try to get that meeting going for you. And then when the meeting time comes, you just sit on the phone with Richard and Roland and either Ted or myself, Ted Walter, our director of strategy, and we have it and do follow up with them. And there's going to be a lot of action around the request for correction as well, the appeal that we just filed. So the Mcelveen Act, it's draft legislation that would do exactly what we've been asking Congress to do, which is establish a new investigation, actually a real investigation. It would be a select committee. It'd be passed in either house of the Congress. And it's actually written in such a way that they have to look at the evidence that nanothermite was used to bring these buildings down. I mean, it's all ready to go. All we got to do is find a brave congressman to step forward and introduce this, and then a whole lot of others to vote for it. But that work will come once we get that congressman on board. But they don't do anything unless they hear from you. That's the nature of politics. So you got to get involved, get informed, and consider your congressman like your representative. Don't let them off the hook. You know, they're doing a lot of telephone meetings right now because of the pandemic. So get on those telephone meetings. Somehow I got on the list for ones across the different parts of the country. And, you know, sometimes I get these phone calls. If you get one of those phone calls saying, hey, do you want to join it's usually a recording, but it says, do you want to join this meeting in progress with your congressman? Join them. And it doesn't matter what they're talking about. Ask them about the Bobby Mcelveen Act, World Trade Center 7. Let them know this is not going to be it's not going to go away. It's not going to be obscured by other things, because at the heart of it, this is the most important issue, and this is what wakes people up. So get involved.
Please. And by the way, you can know that we've taken all this evidence that you've seen today and that you'll see in parts 2 and 3 of this series to the Manhattan U.S. attorney, and in now 60 exhibits. And he's agreed to give it to a special grand jury. But he hasn't done that yet. At least we don't have evidence that he has. So we sued him. And now he's gone, and there's another one in there. And we're hoping for better results. So we'll continue to put pressure on them, as we will the judge, who is now going back and forth between motions to dismiss and so forth with our lawsuit to the FBI, against the FBI, because they did not give our evidence to Congress, which they were required to do in the 2015 congressional 9/11 review. So stand by for results on that. This is why you want to subscribe. There's a lot of things going on. We have 5 New York area fire commissioners unanimously demanding a new investigation with a resolution. That's historic. So that's going places. He says, Christopher Joya, you better believe that when the entire fire service of New York State is on board, we will be an unstoppable force. So he's proceeding. And we hope you'll stay tuned with us so you can find out how that's going. And here is the DVD we want you to share with everybody. It's just a couple of minutes of 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence that you're seeing in this 3-part series. I want you to see this. It's just a taste.
I don't want to be involved.
Oops.
Conspiracy theories, you know, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what Nist has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as Nist, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
Nist has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
Nist excluded the documents from Fema in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
Nist concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-gray crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
No, it's not science. And you can see this 1 hour free version of this DVD free on YouTube. But I recommend you get the hour and a half version, which goes into the psychology of why this information is so difficult for so many people to grab a hold of. And then you also get Meet the Experts, our extended interviews with these 40 experts. It's incredible. We've also produced a 50-page book. Maybe you prefer to read. It's free, the PDF, or you can get the coffee table style book, which is quite professionally developed, published. And then, of course, our classic lecture, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, which combines all three of these buildings. And then just 15 minutes on Building 7 alone, narrated by Ed Asner. That documentary from 2013. It's really good. But let's get to the questions. Andy, I think we have some, huh?
That's right. We got one question today, but it's a two-parter. And so the questions go, Nist said that the drawing for Building 7 did not show any shear studs on girder A 2001. That's question. And so question one is, did Nist ever say that if those studs were present, then the building wouldn't have collapsed? And question two is, did anyone ever ask the builders if that girder had any shear studs on it or not, or not on it?
Oh, so we're referring here to girder number A 2001, which was sitting on column 79. And we're told that by Nist that this girder did not have shear studs, even though the shop drawings show that it did. They lied. So they say this girder moved, was pushed by those long span beams off of its seat on that column. So those shear studs are like 5/8 round rods that are welded to the beam, and they have a head on them, which is embedded in concrete. And there's 30 of them along the length of this beam. So it's very clear that this girder could not have gone anywhere. So no, they did not acknowledge that. And we've asked, we didn't ask the builder. We found documentation in the actual shop drawings of the building of this steel structure, that those girders, 30 of them, were there. So yes, we've done more than just ask the builder. So it's very clear what's going on here. Nist has manipulated the structure 6 ways from Sunday and the input data in their computer model in order to get it to try to mimic what happened. And even though it doesn't look anything or much like the actual video of the collapse, their computer animation. So they've hoodwinked the entire industry, and they've censored all opposition. We cry out to raise these issues. We're ignored by Nist, and when others do it, they're ignored by Nist, and we don't have enough of a platform to be known in the industry. Most architects and engineers are actually completely unaware of Building 7 altogether. Those who knew about it on the week of 9/11 had forgotten about it in the 7 years it took Nist to finally come out with a report about the building. So there's a number of problems and hurdles here to overcome. So we have project due diligence led by our board member, Roland Engel, a civil and structural engineer, who has 60 volunteers altogether who have given 4 presentations so far around the country of the results of the Hulsey study on Building 7. 2 groups of students who are chapter members of the American Society of Civil Engineers, which is unfortunately complicit as an organization in the cover-up of the truth about what happened to this building and the Twin Towers. And so they are under a lot of pressure from us. Let's put it that way right now. We won't stop. With your help, we'll go all the way until the ASCE relents and admits that they're not looking at the science, that they're pulling the wool over their own members' eyes, as is the American Institute of Architects, who failed to notify even one of their 90,000 members about Building 7's collapse at all. And I'm one of those members, and not one bulletin. So, and that's admitted by their attorney in writing. It's a complete travesty of professional conduct. So I hope that answers that question. Andy, did you have anything else to add on that one?
No, I think you covered it pretty well there, and I recommend everybody check out the request for correction that was submitted to Nist. That was a really good analysis of everything wrong with Nist's report. So it's right there on our website under the news section.
Yeah, look in the news section. Great. Well, this has been 9/11 An Architect's Guide, Part 1, World Trade Center Building 7. And what we're going to do, not next week, but the week after, we're going to go to Part 2, the Twin Towers Explosive Destruction. And which we'll be looking at an overview of the towers themselves, the explosions and explosive evidence, sudden near free fall collapse of this building, and high velocity lateral ejections, 80 miles an hour laterally, landing 600 feet in every direction, propelled, trailing thick white smoke clouds. The shattering of the structural steel frame from top to bottom, the midair pulverization of all 90,000 tons of concrete, which is then, of course, not available to crush the building. The steel's outside the footprint. The concrete's outside the footprint. There's nothing left to crush the building. It's 2/3 the way to the building anyway. just right there. So then we find out how that happened in part 3 with the incendiary evidence, much more detail than we've gone into today on molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite. So be sure to join us. And until then, I want to thank everybody for being with us, and thanks for your help, Andy. And we'll catch all of you in 2 weeks from today for part 2. Bye for now.